In the days when kingdoms rose like cedar trees and wisdom flowed through royal courts like oil through prepared vessels, there lived a king whose understanding had been measured not by his own design, but by one who sees beyond the span of mortal years. Solomon sat upon a throne where gold arrived as naturally as rain falls upon prepared ground, yet the gold itself had never been the source of what sustained his reign. From distant shores came tribute-bearers, their caravans heavy with silver and precious stones, their ships weighted with ivory and rare spices. The wealth that entered Jerusalem did not come because Solomon had grasped for it, nor because his armies had seized it through conquest alone. It came because wisdom had been placed within him like a flame within a lamp, and that flame drew the nations as surely as light draws those who walk in darkness. The king's understanding had been given as a gift, yet not as possession to be hoarded. Each morning he would sit in judgment, and his words would untangle the most complex disputes. Merchants would travel months to hear him speak a single sentence that could resolve years of conflict. Queens would journey from the ends of the earth, bringing their treasures not as payment, but as recognition of something that flowed through him, yet belonged beyond him. In those days, the royal treasury grew not through Solomon's striving, but through the natural consequence of wisdom properly applied. Gold accumulated in the palace chambers like water collects in a well-built cistern. The king's servants counted talents by the hundreds, yet Solomon himself understood that his role was not as owner, but as steward of what had been entrusted to his care. The structure of his kingdom reflected this understanding. Each official knew his place. Each administrator fulfilled his portion of responsibility, and the entire realm functioned like a great wheel where every spoke supported the whole. Wealth flowed through established channels, provision reached every corner of the land, and abundance multiplied because it moved according to order rather than whim. Prayer was never absent, but provision remained only where order had already been established. Year after year, the pattern continued. Foreign dignitaries arrived with gifts that would bankrupt lesser kingdoms, yet they came willingly, drawn by the reputation of one who could speak wisdom that transformed their own realms. The Queen of Sheba herself made the long journey from the south, her camels laden with gold and spices worth more than many nations possessed, yet she counted it small payment for the understanding she received. During these golden years, Solomon's wealth was like a river that never ran dry because its source lay beyond the visible realm. He built the great temple with materials that arrived as if summoned by invisible hands. Cedar wood came from Lebanon, gold from Ophir, precious stones from distant mines, all flowing toward Jerusalem because wisdom had created channels that drew them naturally. The king's daily provision was vast beyond measure. His table required 30 measures of fine flour and 60 measures of meal each day, 10 fat oxen, 20 oxen from the pastures, and 100 sheep, besides deer and gazelles and roebucks and fatted fowl. Yet this abundance never strained the royal treasury because it represented overflow, not depletion. The more that flowed out in hospitality and provision for his people, the more that seemed to flow in through tribute and trade. Solomon's ships sailed to distant ports and returned with gold and silver, ivory and apes and peacocks. His merchants traded in the markets of the world, and his reputation as a wise ruler opened doors that military might could never breach. Foreign kings sought alliance with him not from fear, but from desire to participate in the prosperity that surrounded his throne like morning mist surrounds a mountain. In those days, the boundary between wisdom and wealth was clear, though subtle. Wisdom had been given as a trust, and wealth followed as its natural companion. Yet the boundary was not enforced by external rules, but by an internal understanding that both gifts served purposes larger than the one who held them. Solomon knew that his wisdom was not his own creation, just as the wealth that surrounded him was not his own achievement. For many years this understanding remained unshaken. The king used his wisdom to serve justice, to build the temple, to establish trade relationships that benefited his people, and to create systems of governance that brought order to the entire region. Wealth accumulated naturally in this environment, like fruit grows on a healthy tree, without force or manipulation. But understanding, like water, can evaporate when exposed to heat. And the heat that threatened Solomon's wisdom was not external pressure or military threat, but internal desire that grew gradually, like shadows lengthening at sunset. The gifts that had been entrusted to him began to feel like possessions that belonged to him. The wealth that had flowed through his stewardship began to seem like rewards for his own cleverness. The change was so gradual that years passed before its effects became visible. Foreign wives joined his household, not for political alliance as before, but for the pleasure their exotic beauty brought to his aging eyes. Their gods came with them, requiring shrines and temples that competed with the worship that had originally been the source of his wisdom. Gold that had once flowed through the kingdom for the benefit of all began to pool in private chambers, accumulated for the sake of accumulation itself. The treasury that had once been a well from which the entire nation drew sustenance became instead a reservoir that received much but gave little. The very abundance that had marked Solomon's early reign began to create channels that led away from wisdom rather than toward it. His building projects multiplied beyond necessity. Where the temple had been built as a dwelling place for the eternal, his palaces were constructed as monuments to temporal glory. The labor required for these works began to burden his people rather than benefit them. The gold that poured into their construction came from taxation rather than tribute, from the pockets of his subjects rather than the gifts of foreign admirers. The wisdom that had once drawn queens and kings to his court gradually became clouded by desires that grew like weeds in an untended garden. His judgments, while still clever, no longer carried the weight of authority that had characterized his early reign. The nations that had once sought his counsel began to look elsewhere for guidance, and the tribute that had flowed so naturally toward Jerusalem slowed to a trickle. The wealthy king discovered that wealth without wisdom was like a bucket with holes. The more he accumulated, the more seemed to slip away through channels he had not anticipated. His building projects consumed resources faster than tribute could replenish them. His household expenses grew beyond the capacity of even his vast treasury to sustain them indefinitely. Foreign alliances that had once brought mutual benefit became burdens that required constant maintenance. The very wives whose exotic charms had seemed so appealing began to create political complications that threatened the stability of his kingdom. Their gods demanded not only shrines but sacrifices that drained both the royal treasury and the spiritual foundations upon which Solomon's prosperity had originally been built. Yet the king's response to these growing pressures was not to return to the wisdom that had originally been entrusted to him, but to grasp more tightly to the wealth that remained. He imposed heavier taxes upon his people, demanding from them what was no longer flowing freely from external sources. He conscripted laborers for projects that served his own desires rather than the common good of the kingdom. The structure that had once channeled abundance throughout the realm began to concentrate it instead in the hands of those closest to the throne. Officials grew wealthy through corruption rather than service. Merchants prospered through favoritism rather than fair dealing. The very systems that had once distributed prosperity began to hoard it, like arteries that had hardened and no longer carried life to the extremities. In quiet moments, when the noise of construction and the chatter of courtiers fell silent, Solomon would remember the early days of his reign. He would recall the sense of wonder he had felt when wisdom first began to flow through him, and the natural abundance that had followed like a faithful companion. But these memories came without the power to restore what had been gradually lost through small compromises that had seemed insignificant at the time. The king's reputation for wisdom persisted long after wisdom itself had begun to depart from his decision-making. Foreign visitors still came to his court, drawn by stories of his former glory, but they left disappointed by the reality they encountered. The sharp insights that had once solved complex problems were replaced by clever sayings that impressed listeners but provided little practical guidance. His kingdom, which had once been the envy of surrounding nations, began to show signs of internal strain. The prosperity that had lifted all classes of society became concentrated among the wealthy, while common people found themselves bearing heavier burdens with fewer benefits. The unity that had characterized his early reign gave way to regional tensions that would eventually tear the kingdom apart. Still, the gold remained, accumulated in vast quantities within the royal treasury. But it no longer functioned as it had in earlier days. Instead of being a tool that facilitated wisdom and enabled service to others, it had become a burden that required constant protection and management. The wealth that had once drawn the nations in peaceful trade now attracted the attention of potential conquerors who saw abundance without the strength to defend it. The lesson was written not in scrolls or proclamations, but in the slow transformation of a kingdom that had once reflected divine order into one that mirrored human appetite. The same gold that had once been a sign of blessing became a source of corruption. The same abundance that had once strengthened the realm became the means of its eventual division. Foreign kings who had once sent tribute as acknowledgement of Solomon's wisdom began to withhold their gifts. Trade relationships that had flourished under the protection of mutual respect deteriorated into mere commercial transactions. The voluntary submission of distant peoples gave way to calculated alliances based on temporary advantage rather than lasting trust. The temple that Solomon had built in his youth remained beautiful, its gold and precious stones still gleaming in the morning light. But the worship that took place within its walls competed with ceremonies conducted at the high places he had erected for his foreign wives. The single-minded devotion that had once characterized the kingdom's spiritual life became diluted by influences that promised pleasure but delivered only confusion. In his later years, Solomon possessed more wealth than any king before him, yet the kingdom over which he ruled was less stable than it had been when his treasury was smaller. The accumulation of riches had not brought greater security, but had instead created new vulnerabilities that threatened the very foundations of his reign. The officials who managed his vast holdings were more concerned with personal advancement than with the welfare of the people they were supposed to serve. The military that should have protected the kingdom was more focused on maintaining internal control than on defending against external threats. The very systems that had once made Israel the wonder of the ancient world were now consuming the resources they were meant to protect. Yet through all these changes, the memory of earlier days remained like light lingering after sunset. Those who had lived through both periods of Solomon's reign could recall when wealth had served wisdom rather than replacing it. They remembered when abundance had strengthened the bonds of community rather than creating divisions between rich and poor. They knew that prosperity could follow order when order was maintained in proper relationship to its source. The Chronicles record that Solomon's wisdom surpassed that of all the peoples of the East and all the wisdom of Egypt. But they also show that wisdom without restraint becomes something other than wisdom, just as wealth without stewardship becomes something other than provision. The king who had once been blessed with both understanding and abundance discovered that possession could drive out the very qualities that had originally attracted blessing. Near the end of his reign, when the kingdom had begun to show cracks that would eventually split it in two, Solomon wrote words that reflected a deeper understanding than he had possessed even in his youth. He wrote of the vanity of accumulation, of the emptiness that follows the pursuit of pleasure, of the futility of building monuments to oneself. These writings came not from bitterness, but from recognition of patterns that had played out in his own experience. The wealth remained, stacked in treasuries and displayed in palace rooms, but it no longer carried the life it had possessed when wisdom and restraint had governed its use. The gold was the same gold, the silver the same silver, yet something essential had departed from it. Like a lamp that still holds oil but no longer gives light, the royal treasury contained abundance that no longer illuminated the path forward. The servants who counted the royal treasure could report ever-increasing totals, yet the kingdom's capacity to use that wealth effectively continued to diminish. Resources that should have strengthened the realm instead created burden and complication. The very abundance that had once been a sign of divine favor became a weight that tired those who carried it. These are the chronicles of wealth, not as men admire it, but as wisdom was entrusted to carry it.